As European countries are locking down again in the face of a pandemic, we discover the previously secret UK government advice that's been directing its actions as we go into a predicted second wave. Plus, we review the week's news and discuss the downsides of campaigns to feed hungry children. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Yes, winter is coming, and by all accounts, it's going to be a long, hard winter, and that's nothing to do with the weather. France and Germany both announced this week a ramping up of lockdowns against COVID-19. France has imposed an indefinite lockdown, a near repeat of the very strict measures that it imposed back in the spring. No movement outside of home permitted without good reason, which must then be written on a document that you carry and present to the police. The only difference between this lockdown and the previous one is that schools will stay open and, slightly surprisingly perhaps, visits are allowed to retirement homes. In announcing the move, President Macron said the virus is circulating at a speed that not even the most pessimistic forecasts had anticipated. According to the leading French authority on infectious diseases, the Institut Pasteur, 98% of intensive care beds would be occupied by COVID patients by November the 6th. In the meantime, Germany has imposed what's being described as lockdown light. Bars, gyms, theatres, concert halls are closed. Private gatherings restricted to 10 people from up to 2 households. Restaurants to offer only takeaway or delivery. Hotels banned from taking tourists, and so on and so on. Again, Angela Merkel said this: if the infections keep going at this speed, we will arrive at the limits of our health system's capacity within weeks. The thing that all these measures have in common, and there's no escaping this, it's the nature of the beast, is not so much the problem of what is happening today, but the fears of what is quickly going to happen in the future. We got some insight into these forward-looking fears this week when The Spectator magazine published the previously confidential document produced by the UK government's SAGE advisory group that was its, quote, reasonable worst-case planning scenario. SAGE says up front, this is not a prediction, it is a worst-case scenario. It's up to the government which scenario it chooses to plan for, but it then notes that it and the Cabinet Office recommends that the government plans against this one, the reasonable worst-case scenario. And that will have gained some weight because, according to some of the figures, what's happening in the real world over the last couple of months is happening sooner than this scenario even puts forward. It was produced on the 30th of July, noting that it would be updated as new events unfolded, so it will have been updated. So what happens in SAGE's previously unpublished scenario? In other words, what does the government expect to happen next? In its own words, a difficult autumn followed by a large winter peak. 85,000 people to die from a new COVID wave, around a third more than those that died in the first wave. 356,000 people to pass through hospital. The rate of daily deaths to peak at a lower rate than the first wave, but then to carry on for a much longer duration, getting steadily worse until March. Which, if a second wave was going to become a serious thing, would make sense because that first wave really came along late in the season for a respiratory illness like this. The document projects that the deaths would start to surge in December, with 500 dying per day for at least 3 months, then rising to 800 a day in late February. In the first wave, hospital numbers peaked at 19,849. The NHS is being told to prepare for 25,000. 3,301 intensive care beds were occupied. The NHS is now being told to prepare for 5,000. Again, SAGE doesn't say this is the most likely outcome, but under the UK system, this is the basis for planning. So those people who are asking why some areas have been under Tier 3 lockdown, with apparently no sign of an exit on the horizon, this scenario is probably why. Not because of what's happened to date, but because of what's assumed to be on the horizon. As Fraser Nelson observes in his article in The Spectator, the big question is whether the reasonable worst-case scenario is actually reasonable. The big problem with unpublished documents that secretly guide policy is that they're not able to be challenged. The UK hasn't set up a so-called red team of experts to push back on received wisdom. So the SAGE scenario assumes that 66% of people who catch COVID will develop symptoms. Well, the data suggests that should actually be 33%. It assumes an infection fatality rate of 0.7%, but the World Health Organization recently estimated it to be 0.3%. And hospitals are getting better, not worse, at keeping people alive, let's face it. Predicting what happens is difficult. But so far, the situation can always change, but so far, the actual hospitalizations and deaths are not out of line with seasonal increases of respiratory illness that you would expect anyway at this time of year. But the real problem with this kind of document and this kind of scenario planning is that it's focused on a single variable for what is, after all, a multivariable problem. There is going to be a lot of suffering and death that we can reliably predict. And by that, of course, I'm talking about the consequences of lockdowns. In the UK, recent tightenings of lockdown measures have led to more than 500,000 businesses entering a state of significant distress, according to research by the insolvency company Begbie's Trainer. 500,000 businesses. Think how many employees that represents. People who may be joining the flood of the growing unemployed. According to the Dr. Foster website, the impact of the response to the pandemic on standard hospital treatments has been massive. Normally, 13,000 men would be treated for prostate cancer. In 2020, it has been just 4,640. Normally, 16,000 would be treated for lung cancer. In 2020, 9,261. Normally, 46,000 people will be treated for gastrointestinal problems. This year, just 1/10 of that. 31,000 for septicemia. This year, 11,000. Chest pains, many of which turn into heart attacks. 41,500 versus 24,500. Any sensible system that was about trying to maximise the public health outcomes would be weighing up the COVID-19 issue, which overwhelmingly affects people in frail condition in their 80s and above, against the people in their 40s, their 50s, their 60s, suffering from cancer and other diseases, who may have decades of good life ahead of them if treated in good time. Plus then the mental health and the stress and the financial hardship, the ruined life chances, all of it. By focusing on the pandemic to the exclusion of all of those things, by talking about it as though it was the only thing government should plan for, it has massively put policy out of whack. The challenge is that all the pressure is going the other way right now, with everyone obviously now pointing at France and Germany and saying the only rational thing to do is to follow them. So no wonder that there are rumours of a second national lockdown on the way, not least because the SAGE advisors are amongst those urging it. And no wonder also that the tenor of people lobbying against that move has also been increased. A new letter from health professionals and scientists headed "First Do No Harm" was launched this week, arguing that right now the cure is proving to be worse than the disease. It calls for a number of restraint measures, including dealing with the reliability question on PCR tests that I've covered in previous videos. In the first lockdown, there was no debate or pushback to speak of. If there's going to be a second, seems pretty unlikely that will be the case again. Watch this space. Now, in a moment, we'll cover all the rest of the week's news. But first, you may not have noticed, but there's an election going on. I know! You'd think people would have been talking about that. Now, you may be fed up of hearing about it, in which case, no worries. Because very soon now, we'll be past Election Day and into the months of wrangling and legal challenges and constitutional crises before we finally find out who won. So there's that to look forward to. Or maybe on the other hand, it will be very obvious, a landslide for one candidate or the other, at which point then everyone can calm down. Nobody will much need to talk about American politics at all. That's a projection, not a prediction, by the way. Anyway, whatever happens, I will be discussing what we know in my election response video on Wednesday next week. If we have a clear Biden win, I'll be looking ahead to what that might really mean in terms of what the US may be doing on issues like, for instance, climate change. If we have a clear Trump win, I'll be asking some of the same questions, but let's face it, probably getting different answers. And I'll be asking a few other questions as well. Can America even begin to heal itself or reduce its polarised polity given the outcome of the election? And can America, indeed does it even want to, regain its lost ground as a world leader in the face of the challenges from China and indeed from Europe? And with the Supreme Court allowing some states to count ballots up to 9 days after the election day, will America ever sort itself out to just run an administratively efficient election? Let me know if there are specific questions you want me to cover, and join me then on Wednesday, 4th of November. A couple of weeks ago, as we discussed at the time, China announced that it was adopting a net zero carbon by 2060 commitment. This week, we saw Japan's new Prime Minister announce that it would be signing up to net zero by 2050, in line with the UK and the European Union. In his first policy speech as PM, Yoshihide Suga signalled a big shift in energy policy for a country that has had an even deeper reliance on fossil fuels since the Fukushima accident in 2011. Fossil fuels are currently 87% of the country's primary energy supply. Suga said there would be a focus on next-generation solar panels and carbon recycling. Revitalising the nuclear power industry may not be seen as an option given the recent history. Soon after that, South Korea followed through with its own commitment to net zero by 2050. President Moon Jae-in said the country would end its heavy dependence on coal and replace it with renewables under a multi-billion-dollar plan to invest in green infrastructure, clean energy and electric vehicles. A plan they call, in a flash of creative genius and originality, their Green New Deal. I know, I think that could catch on. South Korea was the world's 7th biggest carbon dioxide emitter in 2017, currently uses coal for 40% of its electricity generation. And inspired by these examples, Australia then has looked at which way the wind's blowing, and Prime Minister Scott Morrison was moved to declare, "No way, mate!" I'm paraphrasing, but, probably not much. Morrison has said that Australia will have a gas-led economy from the pandemic, and though recognising the pressure coming from so many of its major trading partners, Morrison has nevertheless been very clear that such policies for Australia will be made by Australia, not by anyone else. Japan and South Korea will face some real challenges moving to this net zero target, but they have indicated their direction of travel this week. No doubt the story's not going to end there. There will be pressures pushing both ways over the coming decades. None of which, I'm guessing, will involve extremist environmental campaigners Extinction Rebellion. This week, Extinction Rebellion made their own unique contribution to the real-world problem-solving needed to address climate change by turning up at the nature broadcaster Sir David Attenborough's house to harass him for saying that campaigners shouldn't break the law. Given that he's 94 and there's, a pandemic that targets the over 80s, they weren't entirely welcomed with open arms. So they had to be content with leaving a letter and a starter pack on non-violent civil disobedience, because you're never too old to start a new hobby, apparently. Now, sure, he does all these documentaries and things and talks directly to powerful people around the world about climate change. Of course, he does those things. But since he's not saying exactly what Extinction Rebellion want him to say, he has to be targeted and re-educated at his own home by campaigners. But were these just a few rogue individuals embarrassing the movement by doing their own thing? We've seen those things before. Nope, the XR website had a press release promoting the action. Did XR have anything to say about these major actions on the part of Japan and South Korea? Arguably a highly significant move on their issue. No evidence they even noticed. This is how a campaign movement fades into irrelevancy. Still, on the plus side, at least they didn't actually cancel David Attenborough. Not everyone's so lucky, because cancel culture is still alive and well. This week, it is the turn of one Kevin Price. Price was a city councillor for Labour in Cambridge and a porter at Clare College. He quit as a councillor last week in protest at his group supporting a motion on trans rights that started like this: trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary people are non-binary. Such statements have become, of course, the new flashpoints, with a number of people, including Councillor Price in this case, reacting against the explicit denial of, basic biological reality, and others taking that reaction as somehow being a denial of the human dignities of trans people, regardless of any qualifying statements that may or may not be made. And the script in this case is very familiar. So Price resigned, saying, "The inclusion of the first three sentences of this motion will send a chill down the spines of the many women who believe that there is a conflict of rights and who want to be able to discuss those in a calm and evidence-based way." Students at the University of Cambridge are demanding that Price be punished for his stand, calling it transphobic, saying that he should lose his job. The union said that Price had shown, quote, "a brazen contempt for the rights and dignity of trans and non-binary people." The UCS trans rep, Frankie Kendall, said students no longer feel safe in not only their college, but in their homes, while Price remains in his normal duties. Really? Having people oppose statements that contradict biological reality makes students feel unsafe in their homes? This is now the way these things get talked about. More fuel got added to the fire yesterday when it further emerged that Kevin Price had been complained about within the council for retweeting 3 tweets that some considered to be transphobic. One of them was reportedly this one. This is, let's leave the name out of this, an adult human male who claims to be a lesbian. Yes, he's kept his dangling bits and has skipped for hormones and believes that real lesbians who aren't into penises are transphobic and should be excluded from the lesbian community. Retweeting that apparently gets you into trouble. Personally, I think there are more constructive things you can tweet, but let's be clear. If a bloke with a beard simply states that he's a woman, yeah, that's going to raise eyebrows. Now, maybe so what? People can just put up with it. If they think it's weird, that's their problem. But if that person is then going to tell lesbians, women who are sexually attracted to women's bodies, that in spite of the fact that they are physically and visually male in every way, they are at fault not to find him / her sexually attractive, so they should be cancelled in their own community. And that's not a trans issue. That's someone behaving like an almighty douche issue. Whatever position you take on that is going to create debate. The students of Cambridge are going to have to toughen up a little if such debates are going to make them cower in their bedsits. Now, in related news, a woman prisoner has sued the government, alleging that she was assaulted by a transgender woman in a women-only prison. The woman says she was abused by a prisoner who had a gender recognition certificate, along with convictions for serious sexual offences against women. The Ministry of Justice doesn't accept that an assault took place, presumably because who could imagine such a thing would happen with a convicted sex offender? I mean, it's shocking. So, of course, while students are allegedly cowering and feeling unsafe because of what the porter might be retweeting, women campaigners point at cases like this and say that this is exactly why women's only spaces were created in the first place. Now, you could have this sort of discussion in a way that was respectful to both parties. But if it's going to come down to an intemperate row for the time being, you'd have to say the women's groups have the most compelling argument right now. Now, there were other big stories this week, of course. The CEOs of the tech companies were grilled in the US Senate, being accused of being partisan and denying it, and the UK Labour Party turning against its former leader, Jeremy Corbyn, over the issue of anti-Semitism, but really a fight over the heart and soul of the Labour Party going forwards. Both of those themes will be running for some time, no doubt. I am always delighted that there's a lively discussion forum on these videos. I respond to as many comments as I can in the discussion forum itself, but let's pick out a couple that have caught my eye to discuss here. One of them on this week's BBC focused video. The BBC has issued an apology for the programme Meet a Threat to Our Planet, nearly a year after it was broadcast. You can't reverse the damage these things do. And yes, this was something that was resolved a couple of weeks ago. It was a documentary that pushed the line that meat production has massive impacts on the environment, and to support that message went to the worst industrial farming locations you could find in the US, which, whether they deserve the criticism or not, which is another question, were nevertheless completely unrepresentative of what happens in the UK, contrary to the implications of the programme. It's worth noting because it followed a very common pattern that's been documented by a number of campaigners in recent years. The BBC makes a biased or indefensible claim. It gets challenged via its own complaints process. It doesn't respond on the timescale it's meant to. That therefore means it has to get taken to the regulator, Ofcom, who then rules against it. And only at that point does it give a tepid acknowledgement. Most complainants, of course, give up well before they get through all that process, which is something bureaucrats know and rely upon. On the video about climate scientists flying more than their peers, I mentioned that they were more likely to pay extra for carbon offsets, which attracted this comment. You realise that buying carbon offsets doesn't actually put the CO2 emissions back in the bottle, don't you? A carbon offset is just a bribe for poor persons not to make their life easier by paying them not to consume the CO2 so you can. It is an evil system of oppression. That's a bit of an overstatement, but I do agree that offsets are generally not worth much and frankly are not how any of the problems are going to get solved. They give a fig leaf for the conscience of the people that sit on flights feeling guilty. Some are better than others. For instance, providing clean tech heating to poor families that otherwise had to burn oil or wood. So long as the solution provided is genuinely better, functionally as well as environmentally, then they can be good. But with all of these things, the differential's hard to establish. Half the time you find those improvements were due to be made anyway by the state, so they weren't really additional based on the offsets that you paid. Ultimately, if you really think adding a £5 or more on the cost of your flight is really going to negate the impact of it, that's kind of wishful thinking. So no, they're not evil, but they're not the answer. Here's an interesting problem. Short version, celebrity footballer Marcus Rashford has been campaigning for the government to continue to provide free meals for disadvantaged children during the school holidays. The government resisted the campaign on principle. One MP, Brendan Clark-Smith, summed it up in the Commons debate when he said this: "Where is the slick PR campaign encouraging absent parents to take some responsibility for their children? I do not believe in nationalising children." It was a clever line, but he got universally hammered, and his comments were treated as a gaffe. Because people, of course, agree. Of course, poor children should be fed, and if you argue against the proposed mechanism for doing so, you obviously don't care about starving children. Sometimes you have to choose carefully which ditch you're prepared to die in for a principle. The government might well point out that universal credit has been increased by £20 per week. That is both true and still nowhere near as powerful as a celebrity on a mission to help the poor in a pandemic. And besides, many of the commentariat will assume, although they won't admit this, that the feckless poor will simply spend the extra universal credit on booze and lottery tickets. And in some cases, hopefully a very small minority, they may be right. So the roughest end of this comes down to, should the government be protecting children from the bad choices of their parents? How could idealistic propositions like that possibly go wrong, I wonder? The pandemic already runs the risk of infantilizing us into thinking the government is there to protect us against ourselves. Without debate, the balance between personal and government responsibility has already been shifting. Now look, eventually the celebrities move on, and all you get left with is the slippery slope they pushed you onto with no accountability for the consequences. Change is easy, but change that makes the world better for the long term, that's a lot harder. Sooner or later, you do have to choose which ditch you're going to get into and fight. Agree, disagree? Let me know in the comments below. Now, you may have noticed this episode is slightly different in structure to usual. I'm trying out this format, hoping that A, you like it, and B, with a view to ultimately increasing the amount of content on the channel overall. I've already shared my thoughts on this with Patreon supporters because doing any of this content is only made possible by their support. If you value the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to provide on this channel, please consider joining the good people that have already signed up on patreon.com/Mallen Baker. From just $5 a month, you can help to make a real difference, and the support is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.